Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Lostville Chronicle. Before we begin, take a second to comment where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see where these forgotten pieces of American history travel in the middle of the night. Tonight's case isn't folklore. It isn't an urban legend. It's a documented disappearance deep within one of America's most unforgiving national parks. In 2016, a father and son vanished along the Alum Cave Trail in the Great Smoky Mountains. 1 month later, the son returned, barely alive, barely conscious, clutching his father's jacket. And what investigators found inside that jacket revealed a truth no one was prepared for. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's begin. Every October, when the air in the Great Smoky Mountains turned crisp and the leaves began shifting from gold to ember red, Carroll and his son Sam repeated the same quiet ritual. They packed a thermos of sweet tea, 2 sandwiches, Sam's favorite trail mix, and drove toward the Alum Cave Trail well before sunrise. It wasn't just a hike. It was their reset, an unspoken tradition between a father worn down by long shifts at the garage and a son trying to navigate early adulthood. On October 23, 2016, everything followed that familiar script. A grey Ford Ranger rolled into the trailhead parking lot at exactly 9:42 a.m., captured briefly on the park's entrance camera. Chris locked the truck, slipped the key into the zipped chest pocket of his hiking jacket, and adjusted the straps of his worn-out backpack. Sam stretched his arms above his head, yawned, and gave his dad a small smile, the kind of smile that carried years of trust behind it. Witnesses would later confirm that nothing seemed unusual. A pair of hikers saw the 2 men near Alum Cave Arch around 1 p.m. Chris walked ahead, steady and calm, while Sam followed a few steps behind, stopping occasionally to photograph the ridgeline with his old point-and-shoot camera. The hikers recalled no arguments, no distress, nothing out of place. "They looked focused," one said, "like they were in their own rhythm." It was the last confirmed sighting of either of them. The afternoon passed without incident. A thin fog, common for the season, rolled low along the trail, settling into gullies and empty bends. By sunset, temperatures dipped faster than usual. When Rebecca Carroll, Chris's wife, glanced at the clock shortly after 8 p.m., she didn't panic right away. The 2 men always returned tired, dusty, and full of stories. But minutes passed, then an hour. She called Chris's phone. No answer. She tried Sam's. It rang out, "Nance," then went dark. That had never happened before. By 9 p.m., her worry hardened into fear. She contacted the park. Rangers mobilized a small unit immediately. Those first few hours were critical, the period when someone lost might still respond to calls, still move, still leave tracks. Search teams combed the lower half of the trail by headlamp and moonlight, calling out the names of the father and son into the quiet dark. Nothing answered back. At dawn, search efforts escalated. Volunteers joined. Drones were deployed where tree cover allowed. Dogs swept the switchbacks, noses low, tails stiff. Helicopters scanned ravines and cliff faces. For 48 hours, the forest pulsed with human effort. Boots, whistles, radio chatter. Yet the mountain kept its silence. Not a footprint, not a dropped bottle, not a torn jacket thread. Nothing. The truck remained in the parking lot exactly as Chris left it. Doors locked, map unfolded on the passenger seat, thermos resting upright in its holder. As if the 2 men had stepped onto the trail and simply never stepped back. By the end of that first week, one truth settled over the investigators like the evening fog. People get lost in the Smokies every year, but 2 experienced hikers disappearing together without a trace in broad daylight, that was something else entirely. Something the mountain wasn't explaining. At dawn on October 24th, just hours after Rebecca Carroll placed the frantic call, the Great Smoky Mountains awoke to the sound of boots, engines, and clipped radio chatter. Rangers formed the first line of organized search. Men and women who knew every bend, every culvert, every deceptive fork along the Alum Cave Trail. They began with textbook precision. Sweep the route up to the bluffs, check every alcove, every ledge where a hiker might shelter or slip. By noon, the team had covered all primary deviations from the trail. Nothing. No footprints in the damp soil, no scraps of clothing snagged on branches, no fresh slide marks on the steep inclines. It was as if the earth had swallowed Chris and Sam whole. Helicopters from the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency arrived next, circling low over the tree canopy. But from above, the forest was a labyrinth of crowns, thick interlocking limbs that left only quick flashes of the ground between them. Thermal imaging devices struggled against the strong temperature gradients created by sun and shadow. The mountains seemed to absorb the heat signatures and dissolve them. By evening, the search expanded. The Appalachian Search and Rescue Group joined with rope teams trained for cliff rescues. Tracking dogs arrived, 2 seasoned bloodhounds and 1 Labrador trained to detect human scent across long distances. They sniffed the air, sniffed the trail, circled, whined, and then lost the trail entirely at a spot where the earth dipped and the leaves gathered deep enough to mask even fresh boots. Such abrupt scent loss usually comes from storms, rushing water, or strong wind. But the weather that day had been calm, mild, still. The forest was giving nothing back. On October 25th, the search radius widened from a mile to 3. Volunteers poured in, locals, hikers, tourists who had seen the story appear on news alerts. They lined U.P. shoulder to shoulder, sweeping the underbrush in slow, synchronized arcs. Drones buzzed overhead, dipping between branches where helicopters couldn't go. But the drone footage returned the same verdict: uninterrupted forest, no campsite remains, no discarded wrappers, no impressions in the soil. Rangers started ruling out the usual scenarios. No rockfall or fresh erosion suggested a fatal slip. No claw marks or broken brush suggested wildlife attack. No signs of panic, struggle, or flight. Even if the 2 men had somehow veered off trail, searchers should have found something, anything by now. A dropped water bottle, a breadcrumb of fabric, a torn leaf with human oil residue. But there was nothing. On day 4, the search reached the ridges above the trail. Teams descended into narrow crevices that required ropes, helmets, and harnesses. They checked stream beds where bodies sometimes drift. Still, nothing. By the end of the first week, the rangers' whiteboards, once full of promising grids and highlighted zones, had become a mural of crossed-out squares. Only 2 regions remained: steep ravines to the north and the thick, lightless rhododendron maze to the east, the one area searchers dreaded. Hell tunnels, searchers called them, places where light barely reached the ground and even GPS signals twisted off course. Yet even those, once entered, gave back no sign. Not a broken twig, not a disturbed rock, not a human trace. By week's end, a chilling sentence began to circulate quietly among the exhausted teams. It's like they never walked this trail at all. The Smoky Mountains are not known for mercy. In late October, fog settles low, clinging to branches like breath on glass. The forest floor grows slick, cold, deceptive. Yet for the next 30 days, hundreds of people stepped into it willingly, trying to find 2 missing hikers who had seemingly dissolved into the landscape. From the morning of October 26th to November 25th, the search expanded in waves, each wider, each more desperate, each returning with the same empty hands. Teams pushed into the ravines first. These were steep, narrow cuts, carved by centuries of water, places where echoes died quickly and light rarely reached the ground. Rope crews lowered themselves inch by inch, swinging lanterns and radios on their belts. They combed gravel beds for impressions. They studied boulders for streaks of disturbed moss that could indicate a fall. Nothing. Next came the creeks. Walker Camp Prong, Styx Branch, Alum Cave Creek. Waters cold enough to numb skin within seconds. Searchers followed each bank, scanning for shoes, clothing, or even the smallest torn scrap that water might have carried. Dogs sniffed along the edges. Divers swept deeper pools with poles. But the currents gave up no secrets. No cloth. No pack. No trace of a body. The ridgelines were searched twice. These high pathways, exposed to the sharp mountain wind, should have revealed anything dropped or broken. Yet every ridge was pristine, untouched, as though no one had crossed it in weeks. Sam's scent, faint but present, appeared several times during the first days, only for tracking dogs to lose it in abrupt, unnatural breaks. Not diluted, not faded, gone, as if the trail ended in mid-air. Veteran rangers began to whisper privately what they refused to say publicly. These disappearances don't behave like normal ones. Meanwhile, the Carroll family lived through the slow-motion collapse of hope. Rebecca visited the trailhead daily. Sometimes she stood in silence. Sometimes she walked a few steps up the path, as if she expected Chris and Sam to appear around a bend, laughing at a simple misunderstanding. Their truck remained in the parking lot, locked, undisturbed, a monument to a journey that never returned. Volunteers refused to quit. They searched the hell tunnels, dense rhododendron thickets so tight that people had to crawl. Searchers described them as natural mazes where visibility dropped to inches. Every movement left cuts and scrapes. Yet even inside these claustrophobic tunnels, where any hiker would have left torn cloth on a branch or boot scuffs in the soft mud, they found nothing at all. By mid-November, the whiteboards in the ranger station were covered with search routes, grids, timestamps, and red slashes marking completed zones. Only a few impossible areas remained, sheer drop-offs, unstable rock slides, and old growth so dense it swallowed sound. But if the two men had been there, something should have given them away. On November 7th, after 14 exhausting days, the official search entered limited effort status. By November 11th, it was quietly closed. The final report used one phrase: mysterious disappearance under unexplained circumstances. No evidence of a fall, no sign of animal attack, no indication of intentional flight, no human traces at all. For 30 days, the Smokies had remained perfectly still, as if whatever happened to Chris and Sam Carroll had been swallowed whole by the mountain, leaving not a single footprint behind. November 25th, 2016. The forest was colder, quieter, older than it had been a month earlier. Fog threaded itself between the branches, and the air carried that sharp metallic bite that signals winter's approach. Most search teams had long since packed up. Only the stubborn remained, the volunteers who refused to accept the official ending. Among them was Mountain Finders volunteer Ben Carter, a quiet man with years of hiking experience and a stubborn streak that wouldn't let him sleep while two people remained missing. His group moved slowly along the banks of Walker Camp Prong Creek, the water rushing over stones slick with moss. Around 3:00 p.m., Carter heard something. Not a cry, not a shout, but a ragged human sound. A breath that struggled to complete itself. At first, he thought it was the creek hitting a fallen branch, but then it came again. A short, strangled inhale. A sound of someone holding on. He pushed through the rhododendron thicket, branches dragging across his clothes like resisting hands. Light thinned. The forest dimmed. After nearly 15 yards of struggle, the foliage opened into a clearing near the creek bed. And there, kneeling at the edge of the icy water, was a young man. Thin, filthy, barely upright. His shoulders shook with each breath, though he made no sound. His head hung low, chin against his chest. His hair was matted, and his face, smeared with dirt, cracked skin, and an uneven stubble that looked far older than 19 days, seemed carved from exhaustion. In his hands he clutched a black men's jacket so tightly that Carter first mistook it for a pack or a blanket. The fabric was torn, stiff with dried mud, and clearly far too large for the boy wearing it. Carter whispered, "Sam?" The young man raised his head slowly, as if the movement required its own decision. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, staring through Carter instant. At him. For a chilling moment, Carter wondered if the boy even recognized human presence. But then Sam blinked, once, twice, and his grip on the jacket tightened, knuckles turning white. It was the same jacket Chris Carroll had been wearing the morning he vanished. Carter radioed the others, his voice shaking as he gave the coordinates. Volunteers converged on the scene within minutes, but Sam reacted to none of them. He didn't startle, didn't speak, didn't move except when guided gently by the arms. He seemed caught somewhere between waking and oblivion. Doctors later called it severe dissociative shock. His body remained alive. His awareness did not. Sam had no backpack, no food, no gear, no shoes beyond battered trail runners barely held together. His hands were scratched raw, his joints swollen, his lips split and bleeding. He had survived on creek water and instinct. Nothing more. But the most haunting detail was his refusal to release the jacket. Even as volunteers tried to wrap him in a blanket, he clung to it, clutching it against his chest, like the last piece of something terrible he couldn't afford to lose. When he was finally lifted onto the rescue stretcher, he whispered one word, the only word he would speak that night. Dad. The forest gave back one Carroll that day, but not the other. At Gatlinburg Hospital, the rescue staff braced for the familiar: shock, dehydration, maybe hypothermia. Those were the usual outcomes when someone survived a month alone in the Smokies. But no one was prepared for the way Sam Carroll arrived, hollow-eyed, barely conscious, and clutching a black men's jacket with the ferocity of someone holding on to the last piece of their sanity. From the moment nurses eased him onto the gurney, his fingers locked around the fabric. They tried gently to pull it aside to check for injuries, but Sam's grip only tightened, knuckles turning bone white, tendons straining beneath his skin. When a nurse murmured, "It's okay, sweetheart. We'll give it back," Sam's body convulsed with panic. His breath turned sharp and shallow, his gaze darting around the room as if the walls themselves were closing in. Only when a hospital psychologist crouched beside him, speaking in a slow, steady whisper, "We won't take it from you. Just let us look," did Sam's trembling hands loosen long enough for staff to slide the jacket free. He reached for it again immediately, fingers grasping at empty air. The jacket was placed into a sealed evidence bag, its weight unexpectedly heavy. Up close it looked abused: torn cuffs, dried mud, deep creases that suggested it had been dragged for long distances. The staff recognized it from the missing persons bulletin: Chris Carroll's jacket. The father, who never came home. As Sam drifted in and out of sedation, the jacket was carried down the corridor to the forensic lab. No one expected what came next. To the naked eye, the stiffness of the fabric looked like ordinary mountain wear: dirt, water, and cold nights. But when technicians carefully unfolded the inner lining, the first shock hit. 2 dark, perfectly rounded depressions, edges frayed, impact rings fully intact. Bullet entry wounds. The lab fell silent. Under bright forensic lights, the truth sharpened further. A faint map of rust-colored stains pressed between layers of fabric. Dried blood, human, forced inward at the moment of impact. It was no tear from a fall, no puncture from a branch. Someone had aimed at Chris Carroll's chest. Someone had fired twice. The jacket was no longer a relic of survival. It was evidence of a killing. Technicians went to work, measuring trajectory angles, analyzing diameters of the entry holes, detecting gunpowder residue embedded in the fibers, studying tearing patterns consistent with close to medium-range shots. Nothing about the damage suggested an accident. These were deliberate, controlled shots, the kind meant to drop a man quickly. Detective Jason Clean received the report within the hour. When he entered Sam's room and saw the boy, skeletal, trembling, flinching at every opening door, he understood instantly what the month-long search had failed to reveal. This wasn't the wilderness swallowing two hikers. This wasn't misadventure. It wasn't weather or bad luck. It was violence. Human violence. The forest had returned Sam still breathing, but the jacket had returned the truth. Chris Carroll didn't disappear. He was killed. And somewhere out there, in the deep, tangled miles of rhododendron tunnels and moss-slick stone, the person holding the gun had walked away unseen. Detective Jason Clean returned to the mountains just after dawn, accompanied by a specialized forensic team. The air was brittle with cold, and the Smokies were wrapped in a heavy, unmoving silence, the kind that settles after something violent has happened. Their destination was one of the most notoriously impenetrable zones in the park, a choking tangle of rhododendrons the rangers called Rhododendron Hell. During the original search, teams avoided this area whenever possible. The brush was so dense that even sunlight fractured into thin, ghostly shards. Rangers described it simply: you don't walk through it, you crawl. But now, with the discovery of Chris Carroll's blood in his jacket and the clear evidence of gunfire, this was no longer an optional grid. It was the only place that made sense. The detectives moved in slowly, machetes slicing through the thicket. Some branches snapped like brittle bones. Others bent unnaturally, reluctant to let anything, or anyone, pass. The ground was uneven, a patchwork of roots, moss, and hidden stones. Each step forward swallowed sound, muffled beneath layers of damp leaves. 20 minutes in, the forest felt different, heavier, watching. And then a forensic tech whispered, "Here, look at this." On a flat slab of stone, half hidden beneath ferns, a dark stain clung stubbornly to the surface. A quick reagent test flashed bright, unmistakable. It was blood, old, but human. Nearby, another ranger noticed stripped bark on a tulip tree. The marks were fresh compared to the surroundings, the wood beneath pale where something, or someone, had scraped violently against it. A few feet farther, the soil showed chaotic depressions, as if feet had slipped, stumbled, fought to regain balance. It wasn't wildlife. It wasn't weather. It was movement. Desperate movement. Clean knelt beside the stone, gloved fingers hovering over the dried blood. "This is where Chris was hit," he murmured, half to himself, half to the quiet that seemed to swallow his words. A metal detector sweep began. The shrill beep cut through the silent thicket like an alarm. Just beneath a layer of leaves, a forensic tech uncovered a brass shell casing. A 9mm, clean, unmistakable, undisturbed, except for the soft cradle of earth around it. Minutes later, a second casing surfaced, lodged between two exposed roots. 2 shots, same caliber, same weapon, same intent. The area around the casings painted the story clearly. Someone had stood here. Someone had taken aim. Someone had fired knowing exactly what they were shooting at. And Chris Carroll, unarmed, unsuspecting, in the middle of a peaceful father-son hike, had been the target. More subtle signs appeared the longer the team examined the site. Ferns crushed in a directional pattern, a boot-sized impression near the stone, a broken branch at shoulder height, drag marks faintly visible in the soft earth. It all aligned with what Sam's traumatized mind had been unable to say. There had been a struggle. There had been terror. There had been pursuit. Detective Clean stood slowly, scanning the twisted labyrinth of rhododendrons. "This wasn't a fall," he said. "This wasn't a mistake. He looked at the casings glinting in the evidence bags. This was an attack. For nearly a week after his rescue, Sam Carroll spoke only in fragments, broken pieces of memory scattered like shards of glass on a hospital floor. Doctors warned detectives not to push. Trauma buries the mind in fog, they said. It protects itself first, reveals later. But slowly, painfully, the fragments surfaced. They always began with the same image, his father falling. Sam would raise his hand and let it drop, palm down, like a stone being released. The gesture was small, almost childlike, but it was the clearest truth he had left. Chris Carroll didn't stumble. He didn't faint. He fell because something hit him. And Sam remembered that moment with terrifying clarity. At first he described a sound, sharp, violent, splitting the forest air in a way nothing natural ever could. Then he described the way his father's body jerked, the way his knees buckled. And then came the darkest fragment, the sight of a shadow in the trees. Not a face, not a voice, just a silhouette, tall, fast, moving with purpose through the thicket. Sam would trace shapes in the air, almost unwillingly, like a man drawing the outline of his own nightmare. Wide shoulders, a dark jacket, something metallic glinting near the hand. He remembered his father whispering something, though Sam could never recall the words. A warning, a name, a plea. Then came running. Sam would clutch the bedsheets and shake his head over and over again, as if trying to outrun the memory itself. He ran blind through rhododendron tunnels, branches slicing his arms, roots tripping his feet. Behind him, the forest exploded into noise, heavy footsteps crashing through brush. He thought they were right behind him. He thought he would die next. But trauma is strange. Even in the middle of terror, another memory surfaced, a memory Sam never fully understood. He returned. Psychologists called it survivor's compulsion, onanity. When a loved one falls, the mind fights the urge to flee. It drags you back, even against reason, even against survival. Sam remembered circling back through the thicket, crawling through the same branches he had just escaped. He found his father on the ground, chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. Chris was alive. Barely. Sam tried to drag him, showed the gesture over and over again, pulling, slipping, pulling again. The jacket came off in Sam's hands. That jacket, the one he would later clutch like a lifeline, had stayed wrapped around his father until that moment, and when it slid free, Sam held it so tightly that the fabric twisted in his fists. Then another sound broke the memory. Gunfire. Not one shot. Multiple. Sam froze in the hospital bed every time he recalled it. Breath quick, hands trembling. He never said whether the bullets were meant for him or his father. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe the mind refused to let him know. What he did remember was the final detail. Footsteps. Close, furious, getting louder. That was when he ran for the last time, bolting into the darkness of the Smokies, holding only his father's jacket and the echo of gunshots behind him. And that jacket would become the only reason the truth ever came to light. Detective Jason Clean had been staring at the ballistics report for nearly an hour when the final piece of the pattern clicked. The 9mm casings recovered in the rhododendron hell matched the type commonly seized in poaching cases across the Great Smoky Mountains, and the 22 LR rounds found nearby were even more telling, the exact small-caliber choice favored by nighttime hunters who wanted to kill quietly and quickly. This was no random act of violence. Someone armed and familiar with the terrain had been there, someone who knew how to move through the Smokies without leaving trails. Clean ordered every ranger violation log from the past year to be pulled. As the pages spread across the conference table at park headquarters, a pattern emerged. Repeated entries. Repeated warnings. Repeated near encounters with men who melted into the woods whenever patrol vehicles approached. Illegal spotlight hunting. salted bait piles hidden miles off the trail, freshly butchered deer carcasses found on remote ridges, and threaded through multiple ranger reports was one consistent detail: a maroon Toyota Tacoma, older model, seen near restricted service roads. The truck wasn't unique, not in Tennessee, but one sighting stood out. A cyclist from Pigeon Forge had reported something days before Chris and Sam vanished. He'd been pedaling up an old forest road when he saw two large men unloading a heavy sack from the back of a maroon Tacoma. He described it as long, rigid, and wrapped roughly in canvas. At the time, he thought it might be trash. But the way the men froze when they noticed him, the way they abruptly shoved the object back into the truck before peeling away, had bothered him enough to remember. When detectives visited him now, he didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said, pointing at the vehicle photo. "That's the one. Two guys. Looked like hunters who didn't want, but to be seen." The tip detonated the investigation. Clean cross-referenced vehicle registrations with past wildlife violations and found two names circling the same address again and again: Liam Weiss and David Bradley, both from the outskirts of Sevier County, both flagged for night hunting, trespassing on backcountry land, and avoiding ranger patrols. Neither had ever shown up in court. Neither had ever paid their full fines. Both were known to vanish into the wilderness for days at a time. Armed, experienced, evasive. Exactly the type of men who would fire warning shots, then panic, and fire to kill. Detectives began quiet surveillance on their residence, a run-down house at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by scrap metal and the remnants of old hunting gear. The maroon Tacoma sat half-hidden behind a shed, its plates mud-caked, as if intentionally obscured. But the most chilling detail came from a ranger who'd dealt with them before. Weiss always carried two guns, he told investigators, a .22 rifle for the hunt, and a 9mm for the trouble. Clean felt a cold certainty settle over him. These weren't hikers. These weren't mistaken hunters. These were predators who treated the Smokies like their personal territory, and who reacted violently when strangers walked into their kill site. And now, every piece of evidence pointed to them. The forest had swallowed Chris Carroll's last moments. But the poachers who caused them were finally on the map. The raid began just after dawn, the kind of cold, grey morning where the Smokies looked more like a silent warning than a national park. Detectives, deputies, and state officers moved down the rural road in unmarked vehicles, engines cut low, radios muted. The house at the end of the gravel drive sat crooked against the tree line. Sagging porch, peeling paint, a yard littered with rusted tools and old hunting gear. It didn't look like the center of a murder investigation, but the soil behind it told a different story. The suspects, Liam Weiss and David Bradley, were already awake when the police arrived. Whether they saw the flashing blue lights bouncing off the pines or heard the crunch of gravel under boots, no one knows. But as soon as the deputies stepped onto the property, both men ran. Bradley bolted toward the side shed, slamming into the warped door so hard it nearly snapped off its hinges. Weiss sprinted straight across the yard, slipping on wet leaves as he lunged for the tree line. The chase lasted less than 30 seconds. Officers tackled Weiss before he made it to the first row of trees. Bradley, hiding behind a stack of old tires, surrendered without a word. The escape attempt told detectives one thing: these men knew exactly why the police were here. While the two suspects were cuffed and separated, investigators moved into the yard. At first glance, it looked no different from dozens of cluttered rural properties. Scrap metal, barrels, broken fencing, tools left to rot in the weather. But behind the house, beneath a sprawling oak tree whose roots curled like fingers into the soil, something looked wrong. The earth was too fresh, too loose, too recently disturbed. Detective Jason Clean felt it immediately. The instinct every experienced investigator develops when something is buried where it shouldn't be. He pointed. Start there. Crime scene. Tex scraped the top layer of soil and leaves. Within minutes, someone whispered, "Sir, we've got fabric." Another scoop revealed more. A torn piece of hiking flannel, darkened by dirt and something colder. Then came the unmistakable smell. They widened the dig, slow and methodical, peeling away the earth 1 inch at a time. And then the shape appeared. A human shoulder, pale beneath the soil. The excavation halted. The area was secured. And within the hour, the medical examiner confirmed what everyone already felt in their bones. It was Chris Carroll. The man who vanished into the Smokies with his son had not died in the mountains. He had been carried here, miles away, and buried by the very men who killed him. Inside the suspect's garage, investigators found the rest of the truth. A 9mm pistol, a .22 rifle, blood traces in the truck bed, clothing fibers matching Chris's jacket. Ballistics confirmed it. The shell casings found in the rhododendron thicket were fired from those weapons. Hours later, during interrogation, something finally broke inside Liam Weiss. He put his head in his hands, shaking, and whispered the words detectives had been waiting for. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. We just wanted them gone. He wouldn't leave. And then... He stopped, breath ragged. We panicked. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't an apology. It was simply the truth. Cruel, senseless, and irreversible. And now, with Chris found and his killers identified, only one question remained. Would Sam ever truly recover from what the mountains and these men had taken from him? When the full truth finally surfaced, after weeks of silence, fragments of memory, and the unearthing of Chris Carroll's body, the investigators felt something they hadn't felt since the beginning. Clarity. The story was no longer a mystery lost in the thicket. It had structure, sequence, cause and effect. Chris and Sam had walked unknowingly directly into a poaching kill site. A warning shot, a panicked escalation, a man trying to shield his son, 2 armed men making the deadliest decision of their lives, and then chaos, raw, blinding, and irreversible. Sam's memory described the moment in flashes, the crack of a rifle echoing through the rhododendron tunnels, his father falling backward as if struck by invisible force, a dark silhouette pushing through branches. The second, closer gunshot that split the air like a snapped cable. He remembered running, then coming back, then running again. He remembered his father's jacket, the only thing he managed to pull away before he fled, the only thing he carried for 30 days. That much was clear. But everything after that was not. For investigators, the survival itself was nearly impossible to comprehend. The Great Smoky Mountains are hostile in November. Cold nights, thin food sources, predatory animals, and endless miles of disorienting terrain. Even trained hikers struggle to last more than a week. Sam lasted a month. No shelter, no equipment, no food pack. Not even shoes in the final days. His soles were found cracked and raw when he arrived at the hospital. And yet, somehow, he lived. Doctors studying his recovery believe he operated in what they called a reptile state, a form of primal survival where the brain shuts down everything except instinct. Drink water, hide, sleep. No complex thought, no planning, just existence. His mind erased the terror in order to keep the body moving. But it wasn't the survival that disturbed the rangers and detectives most. It was what they couldn't find. Search teams reconstructed Sam's path from the gunshot site to the creek where he was eventually found. His route, chaotic but traceable, painted a picture of a boy stumbling through the forest in shock. But there was an unexplained gap, a period of time, estimated to be at least 20 days, where there was no physical evidence of where Sam had slept, hid, or wandered. No crushed vegetation, no imprints near water sources, no recovered clothing remnants, nothing. It was as if he vanished inside the wilderness, only to reappear weeks later. When asked, Sam would shake his head, eyes unfocused. Sometimes he whispered, "trees," or "water," but nothing more. One psychologist said his mind had locked the month behind an iron door. Even years later, rangers familiar with the case still mention the same detail during training sessions. A month in the Smokies leaves a mark. Sam didn't leave one. Which raises a question no one has been able to answer. Not detectives, not doctors, not even Sam himself. Where was he? What part of the mountain cradled him, hid him, fed him just enough to keep him alive, and erased the rest? In the official case file, one final line sits alone on the last page. The boy survived the forest, but we may never know where the forest kept him. And that brings us to the end of tonight's chronicle. A father lost, a son returned, and a trail that held its silence for far too long. Cases like this remind us that the wilderness can hide many things: mercy, danger, tragedy, and sometimes answers we're not meant to find. If you've experienced anything strange in the Smoky Mountains, or anywhere the forest grows deep, let us know in the comments below.